February 2022, headline: Why does the US government have 1.4 billion pounds of cheese stored in a cave underneath Springfield, Missouri? Every word of that headline is gripping, and also completely insane, right? Like, why is there a cheese vault in Missouri? Why are there 1.4 billion pounds of cheese anywhere, let alone in a cheese vault in Missouri? Why is the government in the business of storing huge amounts of cheese at all? And most importantly, is this just a bunch of clickbait? Well, today we're cutting into this wild wedge of cheese history, and you'll be surprised how weird this melty mess gets. Hello, Internet! Welcome to Food Theory, the show that's good enough to warrant a tap of that subscribe button. Today we're pulling a Mr. Beast and doling out the cheddar. To be clear though, we're talking about actual cheddar, not money. So back in February, this shocker of a headline made its way onto my Google News feed with reporting from seemingly okay publications. The Desiree: Why does the US government have 1.4 billion pounds of cheese stored in a cave underneath Springfield, Missouri? Yahoo Finance: What's the government doing with billions of pounds of cheese? All before hitting us with the even more shocking lead: deep in the caves of Missouri, the US government has stored 1.4 billion pounds of cheese for decades. The story went viral on Reddit, it went viral on Twitter. It often came partnered with a 3D rendering of a giant cheese wheel showing what 1.4 billion pounds of cheese would look like if you somehow formed it into one enormous cheese and then plopped it right next to the US Capitol building. Thanks, Vox. Going the extra mile for your journalistic integrity. Okay, so at first blush, this headline sounds way too specific to be made up. At the same time, though, I live and work on the internet, so I see stuff like this and I'm like, yeah, right, no way's this true. So for this episode, I'm definitely curious about the cheese, but I'm honestly more curious about the clickbait. Is this story actually true, or are there more holes in this article than a wheel of Swiss? Here on Food Theory, we spelunk for the truth no matter how cheesy the puns get, so get ready for some brilliant research. First off, I gotta give the article 1 point. Cheese caves are definitely a thing that exist, and not just in my dreams.
Working on my night cheese.
This cave in Springfield is not a one-off kind of thing. The idea is that cool spaces are the ideal environments for aging, preserving, and simply storing cheeses. And an underground cave is gonna keep those cheeses at the perfect temperature without paying expensive refrigeration costs. People have used this exact principle for centuries to store perishable items, so nothing earth-shattering there. That said, if you're imagining some underground lair with narrow passageways and stalactites hanging from the ceiling, the truth is decidedly less exciting than that. Think underground warehouse, kind of like Breaking Bad, but instead of exciting illicit activities, just a one-way ticket to Constipation Town. So, okay, already less exciting than advertised in the headline, but true, I guess. The debunking starts to hit harder though once we find out that this legendary Missouri cheese cave isn't actually a specialized government area for aging cheese. It's less Area 51 and more storage area, owned by a leasing company called Springfield Underground. It did used to be a limestone mine, but these days it's part of a 400,000 square foot complex stacked with 680-pound barrels of foodstuffs. Cheese cave is certainly a fun headline, but it's more like large industrial fridge. Decidedly less exciting, so I gotta make a mark against the US media on that one. Where the story really runs off the rails is when it talks about why the cheese is there. Turns out this is not a case of the cheese just being dumped in a hole in the ground like a fermented Atari ET. No, this isn't mysterious forgotten cheese, or even government cheese as the article implies. It's just regular old cheese used to supply the regular old USA. So where did the article get its information? Let's melt down the history of cheese eating in the USA to see how things really start to stack up. First off, the information the article is referencing actually comes from a long lineage of cheese-related headlines that date back much longer than you'd expect. The 1.4 billion pounds of cheese referenced this year actually comes from an earlier wave of news stories from 2018, including a Washington Post story citing a report from the US Department of Agriculture which tallied up the total surplus cheese stored in commercial warehouses across the United States.
The USDA says that we have a record amount of supply of cheese sitting in cold storage, nearly 1.4 billion pounds.
The United States stockpile of cheese just hit an all-time high. The cheese stockpile weighs over 1.3 billion pounds.
This cheese storage stuff is practically an urban legend at this point. You can actually trace bits of this story and references going all the way back to the 1970s, when the United States was facing an economic recession that impacted the dairy industry, leading to a major increase in the price of milk, considered at the time to be a household staple. Now, we are certainly no stranger to milk on the channel, and it's not always my favorite topic, but this is one of the most infamous moments in dairy history, so with this much cheese in the room, there's no way around it. I guess it's time we lay all the curds on the table. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter had the solution to the country's skyrocketing milk prices: pour money into the US dairy industry to help farmers increase supply. Increasing supply lowers prices and keeps the cow juice flowing on every table. Bada bing, bada boom, it should solve the problem. And dairy farmers eagerly lapped up the $2 billion in government subsidies by producing as much milk as possible over the next couple years. America, though, suddenly had more milk than it knew what to do with. Prices plummeted. We were literally drowning in milk. But you can't drown in milk forever because, once you know it, milk spoils. The shortage problem that led to the surplus problem now led to a major spoilage problem. So the government began to buy up all the unused milk and process it into cheese before it went bad, since cheese has a much longer shelf life than milk. Hooray, huzzah, we solved the problem that was created by our first solution to the initial problem. But wait a minute, now that we had all this extra cheese, we could probably just stop subsidizing the dairy industry, right? Wrong. The dairy industry subsidies continued throughout the 1970s, leading the problem and the US government's massive cheese surplus to grow and grow all the way until 1981, when they finally curbed the dairy's money. But by then, it was way too late. The government was sitting on 500 million pounds of cheese stored across hundreds of warehouses in 35 different states, with no idea what to do with it. In fact, if you dig into the Washington Post archives, you can find an article from 1981 where they interviewed an official from the USDA who said, quote, "Probably the cheapest and most practical thing to do would be to dump it in the ocean." Fortunately, the government came up with a less wasteful solution, kind of. In 1981, Ronald Reagan had just been elected president, and the new administration was left with two issues. One, what to do with over 500 million pounds of government-owned cheese, and two, how to help the millions of Americans who are on government assistance that were struggling from the after effects of the same 1970s economic recession that had led to the dairy subsidies in the first place. So they decided to solve one problem with another. In came the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, shipping cheese out of government warehouses and putting it into the waiting hands of disaster relief victims, as well as anyone on welfare, Social Security, or food stamps, thereby giving us the phrase government cheese, a phrase that's often used in pop culture to represent economic hardship, like in the song FUTW, where Jay-Z describes his rags to riches story as being one from going from eating government cheese in the projects to eating steak in estates. This government cheese was definitely not premium top shelf stuff. It was a processed cheese food that was optimized for getting rid of all the excess milk as quickly and cheaply as possible, no matter how unappetizing it might have been. While in theory, its composition was similar to what we call American cheese today, it left a lot to be desired. According to food writer Tracy Lynn Lloyd, its texture was, quote, "vaguely rubbery and it doesn't melt so much as congeal when warm. Truly, it can be made appetizing via only two dishes, macaroni and cheese and grilled cheese sandwiches." Now, 8-year-old me probably would have been pro more mac and cheese in my diet, but point taken. So if that's the beginning of the cheese problem, what the heck is happening now? The media stories seem to imply that 1.4 billion pounds of cheese that we have today is an extension of the same problem that we just talked about, and yeah, that's a cool, salacious headline, but that's not true. It's not what's really happening here. The US government is, thankfully, no longer in the business of storing cheese, shutting down the last of their government cheese warehouses in the 1990s when dairy prices stabilized. To be clear, the US is still definitely in the business of subsidizing the dairy industry. As we discussed in a previous episode, the dairy lobby is a powerful force in the US, and they're always eager to take a cut of that cheese by selling some of their cheese anytime there's a surplus. For instance, in 2016, the USDA responded to record-level cheese surpluses by purchasing $20 million worth of cheese. But they didn't buy the cheese to dump it into a warehouse and have it gather mold. It spent that money to get the cheese out of private warehouses and into food banks across the nation. And it wasn't the soft, mushy government cheese of the 1980s either. This was hard cheddar. As far as the 1.4 billion pound cheese surplus, that's a tally of all the cheese that's being stored in all the warehouses across the country, most of it owned by major food companies like Kraft, Nestle, and Land O'Lakes, while it waits to be sent out to grocery stores across the nation. That limestone cheese cave in Springfield, Missouri, as we said earlier, it's owned by a private leasing company, but a huge portion of it's rented by Kraft. This picture shows the interior of the warehouse that's being operated by Kraft. And while many of the 680-pound barrels that we see in the photo are storing products like cream cheese and Velveeta, that's just a fraction of what's going in and out of this warehouse. Despite what the coloring of these barrels might lead you to believe, they actually store a variety of products, including Oscar Mayer meats, Jell-O, Lunchables. It's really just like any other food warehouse. So is there something suspicious going on with that 1.4 billion pound cheese surplus? I mean, why would cheese companies leave all that cheese just lying around? Well, again, the answer is a lot more mundane than the sensational headline would have you believe. According to Christopher Wolfe, agricultural economist at Cornell University, U.S. cheese consumption totals around 13.5 billion pounds per year, meaning that most of that cheese surplus is just getting cycled through all the time. It's true that some cheese is stored longer because dairy production is seasonal. Dairy production peaks in the spring, but dairy consumption is at its highest during the holidays when we stack our Thanksgiving plates high with homemade mac and cheese and spend the entirety of December disregarding our waistlines. Wolfe describes this as a counter-cyclical relationship between supply and demand, where we have to take some of the milk that's produced in May and June and make it into cheese and butter and other products that we then store. So there you have it, friends, the shocking truth about America's 1.4 billion pound cheese surplus, which isn't actually all that shocking at all, but does leave us with some interesting lessons for today. The first being, most of what you read is clickbait. Surprise, surprise there. But even if you do end up reading the whole article, a lot of times what you're seeing is just the tip of a much less scintillating iceberg. So if a story sounds too interesting to be true, there's a high likelihood that it is. The second major take home though is that right now we have the opportunity to not repeat Cheesemageddon if we take this little slice of history with us. Right now, food prices around us are rising everywhere. I mean, talk about headlines, the story of 2020 is inflation this, cost of living that. It is clear to see that this is a similar environment that set us up for cheeseflation back in the 1970s. There's a chance that if we pay attention to what happened last time, we don't make the same mistakes this time. Then turn those mistakes into cheese, then hide that cheese in an underground cave, and then wait for the cheese to go moldy, and then try to give that away to unsuspecting citizens. Those that don't learn from history are apparently doomed to eat cheese. But hey, that's just a theory. A food theory. Bon appetit.